Well, usually people are excited when they get in one of the nation's leading newspapers, but I'm not sure Bill Whittle is going to be. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, I saw a note on your Facebook page from one of your supporters and possibly members at BillWhittle.com who said you were in the New York Times. And so I went to that page. Have you seen the story?
I haven't read the story, but I've seen the story.
Okay, so you've seen the picture at least. They have a kind of a collage that has a bunch of people in it, and we'll show that on here. But in any case, Bill, basically it's the story of a young man that the New York Times somehow found after he posted a video on YouTube. His name is Caleb Cain. He's from West Virginia. He was raised by his grandparents, went to college, suffered from depression, dropped out of school, went back to live with his grandparents, got sucked into what he refers to as the rabbit hole of right-wing videos on YouTube, and then began to believe as in what he now refers to as a decentralized cult of far-right YouTube personalities who convinced him that Western civilization is under threat from Muslim immigrants and cultural Marxists, that innate IQ differences explain racial disparities, and that feminism was a dangerous ideology. Now, Bill, you're not mentioned in the story, nor are you mentioned in the 38-minute video, of which I watched in its entirety. However, it starts out with Stefan Molyneux and goes into Steven Crowder and Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and other names, Lauren Southern, other names that some people might recognize. First of all, Bill, let me just say it this way. I'm a little hesitant to even talk about this guy because after watching the video, clearly he's a troubled individual. He's a liberal who became a far-right conservative, so to speak, or libertarian, who then went back to being a liberal. When he went to college, he thought he was going to make solar panels for a living and make the world a better place. Kind of instinctively, when you first hear about this, what's your reaction?
My first reaction when I saw the cover was to sue them.
Why is that? Why would you sue them?
Because they're talking about how the internet turned this guy basically into a neo-Nazi.
And by juxtaposing your picture in that
Precisely.
group? Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I'm not the only one on that montage who's talking about it either. But let's just assume that nothing comes of that because that's an entirely different issue.
Sure.
You know, this kind of thing, I love to tell you, it doesn't bother me. It bothers me enormously. But probably the big issue to talk about here is anybody who equates, here's the problem, Scott. In Europe in the 1920s and 30s, left wing meant the communist, right wing meant the fascist. That's just the division down the aisle on a European parliament. Here, right wing means conservative, left wing means progressive. But what you often see the left do is equate the European right wing, which is Nazism, with the American right wing, which is conservatism. And we are far further away from Nazi beliefs than the modern left is.
So what you're talking about here is just the kind of content that Mr. Cain was consuming for, he says, 5 years before he came out of this vortex. And the New York Times is not just going after the ideas of the people that are mentioned in this article or that the people that Mr. Cain mentions in his video, but they're going after YouTube and basically saying once you start watching videos on YouTube, all YouTube wants you to do is keep watching videos. And so you may start out with something that relatively benign with a non-political point of view, as was Stefan Molyneux for Mr. Cain initially, and then start watching Stefan's political videos, and then start watching the videos that are recommended by YouTube. And next thing you know, you're an alt-right neo-Nazi. Do you think that the New York Times at least has that part of the recipe right?
Let me just ask this question as a prelude to the next question. What harm has this person done? Did he shoot up anything or Did he
Well,
beat up people?
that's interesting that you say that, because he said that he has never saw himself as a bad person during this entire time, and that he never hated anyone. But the real wake-up moment for him was when he was listening. A couple of moments happened. One of them was a debate with a transgender activist who he said mopped the floor with a right-wing person that they were debating. And then he heard the what do they call those? The manifesto of the New Zealand shooter, and basically said, hey, that stuff that he's saying is all the stuff that I've been sucked into believing. And he says, I realized how effing wrong I was. But no, Bill, to answer your question, not only did he say he didn't do anything bad, but he never even hated anybody as a result of this. And he never saw himself as a bad person in the whole process.
So the New York Times, with the full resources at its command, the most progressive, the Gibraltar of the progressive ownership of the news media, with essentially unlimited resources over the course of 10 years, scouring the web to find somebody who they could say warranted the censorship of conservatives on a basis of inciting violence and hate. The worst they could come up with, the most dramatic case they could come up with, was of a confused guy who said that something that somebody said kind of made sense, but that he didn't hate anybody and never wanted to hurt anybody. Did I get that about right?
Yes, although I think you're giving the New York Times too much credit. It's not exactly like they did a bunch of investigative work and found this guy. It's that he made a 38-minute video that got a lot of attention.
No, you're wrong about that. I'm not trying to say that the New York Times precisely has teams of investigators looking into every word the conservatives say. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that's what Media Matters is for. That's why Media Matters is paid for by George Soros, to look at the hundreds of hours of spontaneous, off-the-cuff commentary that conservatives make in the course of a given week. And after having watched this for the course of 7, 8 years, 10 years, 5 years, whatever, let's say 3 years for going back to Jordan Peterson. After having Media Matters look at this stuff and having them break down every single word, unscripted word, every single off-the-cuff remark that you and I have ever made, that Ben Shapiro ever made, that anybody else ever made, when they're trying to find enough harm to cause the censorship of conservatives on YouTube, the best they can do is come up with a guy who said that he had some things that he didn't know, and then he heard this guy from New Zealand said that kind of made sense, but he says, I've never hated anybody, and I don't want to hurt anybody. If this is the worst that conservative opinion can do to a person, then I think that is a most resounding endorsement of conservative values I've ever heard. If this is the worst that they can come up with, I'm just completely blown away. This is from the people who support Antifa, Black Lives Matter, riot in the streets, the assault on people who are trying to speak their mind, the assault of people who happen to be wearing a red hat. This is what the New York Times represents. I'm not saying that they represent it so much as, yeah, that's what they represent because they support these positions. So there you go. And so I think in that light, it actually is a pretty telling thing. You know, we've talked about this before. You can often be acquitted by the weakness of the evidence that is presented against you. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. The absence of evidence is, or the weakness of the evidence actually makes your case stronger.
So if somebody accuses you of something, and this isn't a mom and pop operation, but if somebody accuses you of something, and their best evidence is this guy, I don't hate anybody and I don't want to hurt anybody, therefore we need to shut down conservative speech on YouTube, then that is not only an acquittal of me and everybody else who's in that montage, it's also a condemnation of the New York Times, because if you are going to go with that as if this is your cause, if this is the noble cause that caused this story to be written, this terrible, terrible, terrible thing that's out there, this doesn't sound so terrible to me, Scott. And the fact that they have to manufacture a case out of somebody this innocuous and harmless, and let's not forget, by the way, we're not just talking about a couple 100 million people in the United States. We're talking about billions of people who have access to this stuff, billions of people, and millions of hours of commentary on the part of all of us who were in that montage. And this is the best they can come up with? This is it?
It was under the headline of the making of a YouTube radical. But Bill, I guess I want to press you.
If the Times is going to run a slanderous article like this, the least they can do is get the fundamental terms right. That should have been the making of a YouTube reactionary, but continue.
I want to pursue this whole issue that the Times brings up of the way that YouTube's algorithm works. And they point out that there is a new kind of portion of their programming that has been able to bump up viewership time by like 1%, which is huge on YouTube. Basically, the whole thing is geared to feeding you something that they already know that you like, and then feeding you more of that. And the Times assertion was that takes you down this rabbit hole, because let's say they start out watching Bill Whittle videos, and that's rather benign in the vast scheme of things when you talk about the inflammatory rhetoric of the alt-right, for example.
Yeah, I'm a gateway pundit.
You're a gateway drug, and it's not because of you, though. It's because of YouTube. Because YouTube will then put a video next to yours that is maybe a little bit more strident, a little more extreme, and next thing you know, step by step, you're going to a dark and ugly place. Does that concern you at all as a content creator?
Well, first of all, let's just assume that you were to watch a video of the Young Turks, let's say. Young Turks are progressive commentators. It's a left-wing commentator thing.
Yeah,
they are far more violent, and their imagery and their vocabulary is far more violent, and certainly more profane than ours is. So, did the Times also look to see if anybody who has gone down that rabbit hole ended up looking into things of like hardcore socialism, or maybe the American Communist Party, or maybe Antifa? Maybe some of these things that they said on Young Turks led to somebody joining Antifa. And if they joined Antifa, that means they had a brick in their hand or a bike lock or whatever the case may be, and they actually assaulted somebody, not just came out of this feeling, I don't hate anybody and I don't want to hurt anybody. So the first thing you want to ask is if this entire rabbit hole theory is what the Times is trying to talk about, what is their justification for exploring just this one rabbit hole that doesn't go very deep, Scott? As we said earlier, if this is the best they got, then that's telling you something. What about the other rabbit holes, if that's true? The second thing to say is, you cannot. I was slandered by having my picture in that montage, because the story says that this guy ended up as a neo-Nazi, which I am not only not a neo-Nazi, I hate the Nazis with a burning passion. My dad fought the Nazis. I fight against Nazism, National Socialism. I fight about that every single day of my life, trying to prevent that kind of totalitarianism from coming here.
Well, Bill, and Mr. Kane is very careful to point out in his video that during this entire time, his best friend was black.
Boy, this sure is
damning.
This is quite a pretty damning indictment of conservative commentary, isn't it, Scott?
Well, let me just...
Pretty damning. And it's certainly worth the pages of the New York Times print edition. I'm beginning to feel better about this lawsuit, frankly.
It is a question that I've raised before, because I was a journalism major. When you read a news story, you always have to ask yourself, what is it that they're not saying? What is the missing part of the story? Because you tend to just evaluate the information as you see it and never take into account what you just raised, which is what would happen if you pursued this same line of inquiry with regard to other political parties or right. other kinds of YouTube commentators.
Okay, so that's the argument. That's the argument of selectivity, and so the first argument is that there's no harm here, really. If this is the most damaged person that they could find, and he says, I don't hate anybody, I don't want to hurt anybody. Okay. Second is, this is what happens if you start going down the conservative rabbit hole. We didn't look at what happens if you go down the Marxist rabbit hole or any of the other rabbit holes out there. And then the much bigger issue, of course, is at what point does the kind of commentary I do, and let's just go right straight to Stormfront. Why not? What's the difference between my commentary and the commentary of open Nazi, American Nazi Party people who are out there calling for all of these horrible things, none of which I believe in. What's the difference between the two? Well, if somebody's going to try and parse the difference between the two of us, and there's a significant difference, I might say, to understate this case as grandly as I possibly can, then you have to start asking yourself, at which point along that spectrum does somebody come in and intervene? And what the Times is making the case of is that you should intervene before you even get to Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Steve Crowder, Dave Rubin, the gay.
Rubin is mentioned, yes.
Yeah, he's the gay former liberal is mentioned now as a guy who's created a homophobe, who's ready to go out and snap and murder people.
Well, no, it's this. I want to be clear though. The story is not that direct. It doesn't attribute to any individual YouTuber the conversion of this guy's thinking, nor does it convey specifically that any one of these individuals gave this guy bad ideas, for example. However, what your allegation, and I think your accusation against them, is accurate, because it's saying by grouping all those people together, showing their photos, listing some of their names, and putting it under the headline of the making of a YouTube radical at a time when there's a big discussion about hate speech on YouTube and people like Steven Crowder, whose name is mentioned, being demonetized and possibly marginalized as far as the algorithm goes. All of that is meant to imply something that they may not state directly, I guess.
Precisely, and I have to tell you, my just absolute incandescent rage at this slander is tempered somewhat by the fact that if I'd been left out of that, I would have felt like I wasn't trying hard enough.
That's right. Well, let me tell you, as a journalism school graduate, they didn't slander you; they libeled you.
I beg your pardon.
It's totally
You're absolutely
different.
right.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's an important distinction, and you're right. They libeled me and everybody else. Now, the reason that this story is a story is very, very simple. And despite all of the froth and everything about my name being in here, put all of that aside. It doesn't matter, really. For the people that are watching this, and for God's sake, if you're going to share an episode, please share this one. It's very important. For the people that are watching this, you need to understand one thing and one thing only. It's got nothing to do with me, Crowder. It's got nothing to do with Stormfront or Nazis. It's got nothing to do with this guy. It's got nothing to do with anything. After Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and then after 1 year of a temper tantrum trying to make sure that this wasn't actually some kind of bad dream, the left decided that the reason Hillary Clinton lost was because the American people got to hear the other side of the story somehow. Turns out they got it mostly through the internet. And after that happened, they decided that this was never going to be allowed to happen again, and that they were going to take whatever bruising and whatever punishment that they needed to take in terms of publicity, they were going to take it in order to get rid of all of us. Now, I found out yesterday that not only was Steve Crowder demonetized, but my understanding is 1,000 other channels were also demonetized by YouTube. And they are doing everything they can to do this. So if you're watching this episode, it's not a membership pitch. You know, we do that every episode. I don't care if you're a member or not on this level. On this level, what you need to understand is that all of it, is not just a bunch of people bitching about something. It is an ongoing effort for the left to make sure that you never, ever, ever hear another side of the story, the rational side of the story, opposing facts, better arguments. You don't get to hear any of that. And that is their mission. And if you are willing to put up with that, if you're willing to take that, then you get the country you deserve, and so do I, which is why we're out here fighting this fight every single day. Every single day. If this doesn't motivate you to do something, then nothing will. And when your grandchildren are wearing their armbands, you'll wonder what happened. But we know what happened. What happened is that we allowed this tyranny. It's social tyranny. Censorship is not coming from the government because we are prepared for censorship from the government. That's why we have guns. But what they're able to do is to cut off your revenue, cut off your ability to communicate, and then and totally destroy your reputation, so that with the simple wave of a hand, Bill Whittle said this. He's a neo-Nazi. I saw it in the New York Times. See how it works?
Bill, I just double checked on our YouTube channel to make sure, but the recent episode that we did of, I believe, of Bill Whittle Now, under the headline, Shut Up, Steven Crowder, YouTube Progressive Speech Code Crackdown, it's been demonetized.
Imagine my shock. Imagine my shock. Now you're going to get a brief pitch if you're still with us, and I'm going to make this exceedingly brief. Because of YouTube's constriction of our videos, when I was doing firewalls 2-3 years ago, they never, ever, ever did less than 250, 300,000 views. That was a catastrophic failure. Now they're getting 26,000. They're getting a tenth of what they used to get as the floor. And they're doing that so that you don't get to hear anything that might change your mind about how awesome progressivism is. Now, the revenues that we get from YouTube are essentially insignificant. We're on a tight budget, so they help. But essentially, it is not our model. Our model is to find enough citizens who are scared to death about this kind of oppression and totalitarianism to be willing to part with $9.99 a month in exchange for 50 episodes, which is mostly you and me and Steve, talking about this problem and giving concrete examples. And if you're not willing to pony up, then there's nothing I can do about that, but I'm doing everything I can right now. And so is Scott. Scott's working at a furniture store as well as doing this. We're doing 50 shows a month. I don't know if I said a week. We're doing 50 shows a month here for $9.95. And we're watching this totalitarian wave just sweep across the country. And if we had 5,000 American patriots who were behind this thing, we would be not only out of the weeds, we'd be able to advertise our way out of this hole that they're putting us in.
And produce a lot more content, as if
right.
50 episodes a month wasn't enough. Let me finish up with this. If you read all the way down to the bottom of the New York Times story, and by the way, if you do sue the New York Times for libel, I think that you should at least say a kind word about the fact that they used a relatively old picture of you. So it's kind of like,
and it's a Stratosphere Lounge picture.
Yes, it's kind of like real estate agents who have their business card show a picture of them when they were 28 years old and they're now 60.
I find myself strangely unsoothed by this observation.
I do my best. So here's what it says at the end of the New York Times interview. It says, near the end of our interview, and I'm quoting now, I told Mr. Kane, the reporter is speaking in his or her own voice, I told Mr. Kane that I found it odd that he had successfully climbed out of a right-wing YouTube rabbit hole only to jump into a left-wing YouTube rabbit hole. Earlier on, they point out that he's watching dozens of left-wing videos every day now instead of right-wing videos. I asked if he had considered cutting back on his video intake altogether and rebuild some of his offline relationships. He hesitated and looked slightly confused. For all of its problems, he said, YouTube is still where political battles are fought and won, and leaving the platform would essentially mean abandoning the debate. And here it comes, and I knew you knew it was coming, but he now has a new YouTube channel that he'd sure like you to tune into.
Is that a fact? Well, I wish him luck in his endeavor. And while I'm being sarcastic about the individual, nevertheless, I find myself thinking, no, I really do wish him luck in his endeavor, actually, because he didn't put that montage together. He didn't write the story. He's not the New York Times. He's just a confused guy who's interested in politics, and now he's made a little splash, and he's on the cover, not on the cover, but he's in the New York Times. He's not in the Dayton, Ohio, Messenger.
Penny saver. Yeah.
Yeah, money saver. That's the word I was looking for, actually. So he wants to have a YouTube channel, and that's fine. And the reason I think that's fine is because I think everybody should have a YouTube channel, and I don't think YouTube should get to decide. And furthermore, I didn't get a chance to finish this. No doubt this particular quote will be taken out of context, and I'll be able to see it in big letters, at which point I'll be able to go right back to the video where I talk about it being taken out of context. So here it comes. You either censor everything or you censor nothing. You either make YouTube into the Hallmark card of the internet, or you don't censor anything. That includes these bastards over at Stormfront, and includes these Antifa violent sons of bitches, and the American Communist Party, and all of them. All of them have a right to be there in a free country. And if you don't like it, don't watch it. And if you're saying that watching somebody's content turns them into a monster, then your political philosophy is very different than mine. Because my political philosophy is that individuals will behave according to individual lights, and to live our lives so that we don't either upset or influence the most unstable person in our society is the kind of a straitjacket that the left not only wants but needs in order to rule free people through totalitarianism. So make up your mind, decide which country you want to live in, and then decide whether or not it's worth your money. If it's not worth your money for Bill Whittle, that's fine. Then pay it to Daily Wire or pay it to CRTV or pay it someplace. I don't care. I'd like to have it come here, but to sit there and to hear this and to understand that this is going on and to realize that we are not selling soap commercials in the middle of an episode of Cheers. We have to make a living somehow. If you're not going to do something about it, then you have no right to complain about it when it happens. And I'm as serious as I can be about this.
And if you do want to complain about it, start your own YouTube channel.
Yeah.
For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. I want to not only thank our members for making this possible, but I noticed after the Steven Crowder video posted today, and I'm attributing it to this, it may be other factors. It could be the new firewall that Bill just posted. But it seemed today that we were getting a relatively unusual increase or flow of new members signing up. So to the extent, it's not a huge avalanche, but to the extent that I wrote a note to Shelley at the office and I said, "Are you doing something unusual over there?" And she said, no, she wasn't really doing that. So, and Bill, I think all that says is I think there are some people who understand the seriousness of this situation when you have all your eggs in one basket, and the people who own that basket decide that those eggs are their eggs and they can do with them what they please.
I would like to just say one more thing along those lines. And I know it's that hoary old cliche, but nevertheless, here it is. So having my picture associated with neo-Nazis in the New York Times may not cause you to actually do something and invest in one of these conservative outlets. But if you don't, and you are an American patriot, then the day is going to come when it will be your picture. It will be your picture. Because once people like us are silenced, then it's just a matter of beating everybody down into the state of fear that the left has always had to have in order to govern the way they govern. So if this isn't enough, okay, when will it be enough? When it's your picture, when it's your son's picture, or your wife, or anybody else? Whose picture is it going to be with essentially an armband, a Nazi armband around their arm, in order to convince you that this is something you better take some action on?
For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members of BillWhittle.com for making this possible.